Hello, this is a brief video about the economic system known as Manorialism, which is the economic system associated with the feudal political structure and system. So I'm going to get started right away. These are the two images I selected. A medieval castle from England, a good physical representation of feudalism and manorialism in the Middle Ages. But I also included a Roman villa because the seeds of feudalism and manorialism they're actually planted in the late Roman Empire as Rome is decaying as an empire. Excuse me. Um, so to get started, the layout for the presentation. First, talk about the historical setting from which feudalism and manorialism developed, starting with the late Roman Empire. Second, moving into feudalism, what it is, how it works, and how it comes about. And finally, moving on to manorialism, the economic system of feudalism, how it works, and what it tries to accomplish. So, historical setting. How does feudalism come about in Western Europe in particular? Well, the place to look to when analyzing when feudalism started to develop is as the Roman Empire is declining in power and strength. And there are different places you can look to. There are different emperors you could point to, different events that happen in the Roman Empire that signal the decline of the empire. The event, I guess you could say, I have chosen to illustrate the decline of the Roman Empire is the splitting of the empire into four different regions by Diocletian, who is actually a relatively capable emperor. I wouldn't classify him as a bad emperor by any means, but his decision to decentralize the empire, it really starts to signal the problems that are present in Rome at this point in time. So, what does Diocletian do? How does it work? He establishes what's known as the Tetrarchy. As I previously said, he breaks up the Roman Empire into four regions. There's one region located in what is today known as England and France. England, not the United Kingdom. It's only England, south of Hadrian's Wall, not Ireland. One region located in Italy and Spain, and North Africa, directly south of Italy and Spain. One region located in Greece and the Balkans, including Constantinople, and the final region located in the Middle Eastern areas owned by the Roman Empire, so Syria, Judea, those sorts of places. And he establishes two classes, if you will, of leaders. One is the emperor, who is known as Augustus, and one is the junior emperor, known as Caesar. The emperors, the ones with the title Augustus, they rule in Rome and in Constantinople, those interior regions of the empire. They own Spain through Greece, basically. On the other hand, the junior emperors, the Caesars, they govern the lands on the periphery of the empire. So there's a Caesar who's ruling in France and England, and there's a Caesar who's ruling in the Middle East, basically. And while this isn't exactly a feudal system, this sort of decentralization where you have an emperor at the top and a junior emperor below him, it mirrors the relationships found in feudalism where you have a king who has a duke associated with him. And it's through I'm not going to get into feudalism actually, that's going to be confusing. At the highest level of government, this decentralization is a good place to look to the seeds of feudalism. And moving forward in time, Diocletian isn't the only Roman emperor to begin this process of decentralization. As was mentioned in this bullet point here, Rome has a lot of problems. You can Google the problems the Roman Empire has. I'm sure you'll find 150 plus articles about everything that's wrong with Rome. The three most important and significant problems that Rome is facing that cause this decentralization. It's number one, the fact that Rome is a humongous empire, and when all of the leadership in Rome is effectively based in the city of Rome, it's very difficult to protect the border in Syria, the border in the border with Scotland, the border with Germany. You can't efficiently protect the empire. You can't efficiently increase productivity throughout the empire when you're governing solely from Rome. The second problem you have is that the Roman Empire, the population is either stagnant or it's declining as the empire is decaying. So, which kind of goes hand in hand if you think about it. And the final problem you have is that every other year it seems you have a barbarian group, a clan, knocking on the gates of Rome, asking you to settle in Roman territory or trying to sack Rome twice or, pillage, what have you. So you have all these problems, right? So picking off of that, or proceeding from Diocletian's initial decentralization, subsequent emperors decided they would try to decentralize the empire further. And you do this by giving local lords, those patricians, there's two classes of people in Rome. Patricians are the noblemen, plebeians are your common folk. Giving the patricians as much autonomy and power to govern their own land as possible. And here's the intuition behind that. The intuition is that because Rome is so vast and it has fewer and fewer resources to govern, by handing over the responsibility of governing to the patrician who actually owns the land, that patrician is going to be the best person to optimize productivity, to protect that land. And this process of decentralization is really it's pushed forward at a really fast rate. And there's a couple of policies that the Roman Empire actually institutes over this period of time as the empire is declining to help make this possible, to make those patricians as powerful as possible and help them produce as much output as they can on their land. The first thing they do from an imperial standpoint, this is empire-wide, they make freemen and slaves, the individuals who are actually laboring on the agricultural lands owned by the patricians, they tie them to the land. And what I mean by that is they make it so that these people, the freemen and the slaves who work for the patrician, they have an obligation to work an X amount of time or for a certain amount of output to the patrician each year. And this class of people became known as the coloni. I don't speak Latin. I'm pronouncing it like Italians would pronounce it. But really what this is very similar to, there's a direct link between these coloni and serfs. And I'm going to go over what a serf is later when we get to Manorialism and feudalism. But this right here, this labor reform that ties all of these people to the land, that's really when serfdom, the seed for serfdom, is planted. In addition to this reform, there are other reforms that the Romans made. For example, they tried to link children to the professions of their parents, and the reason for doing this is actually kind of simple if you think about it. If you have if you had initially 1,000 blacksmiths and 20 years later you have 900 blacksmiths, you want to try to make sure that those 900 blacksmiths are able to produce more per blacksmith than their forefathers were. So, if your father was a blacksmith and he can teach you things and you can become very specialized being a blacksmith, you're going to want to have the child become a blacksmith. That's basically the intuition behind that child inheritance of profession, which that also becomes very popular in the feudal period. The link isn't quite as direct as this one, but it's important to note that during the Roman Empire, these medieval-like policies, this is when they're born. They're not born all of a sudden in the Dark Ages when everybody becomes stupid and we're all barbarians like some history classes would have you believe. No, the Romans know what they're doing. They have a specific goal in mind. Their goal is to try to save this empire that's decaying every year, it seems. So, what's going on then? as the empire falls, why is it that feudalism, there's a break in history classes, it often seems, between feudalism and the Roman Empire? Well, it's because as the Roman Empire falls, and this is not the only reason Rome fell, because of barbarian invasions. Again, look it up. I'm sure you'll find every problem that you could possibly think of as the reason for why Rome fell. But one reason that Rome fell that's widely, I would say, accepted by most people is that barbarian invasions into the Roman Empire, this green area, particularly the Western Roman Empire, because again, Diocletian has split the empire effectively in two. These barbarian invasions really bring Rome to its knees in the West and cause the empire, which is governed from Rome, to cease governing all of this land. Now, there are different end dates for the Roman Empire. I'm choosing the year 480 AD because it's the last year in which a Western Roman Empire emperor is recognized by its Eastern counterpart as being the emperor of Rome. Different people have different years. It really doesn't matter. What is important is, though, just because Rome doesn't govern all of this land does not mean that Roman traditions and Roman laws, if you will, cease governing all this land. In fact, what oftentimes was the case was that these different barbarians who invaded, they simply replaced the Roman lord of the land and instituted one of their own clansmen as the lord. And I'm not using barbarians as a pejorative term, by the way. That's what Barbary is, what the Romans referred to all of these different people as. So who are these people? Well, there are different people. Just to kind of put a face to the name, I believe is the way the phrase goes. Let's talk about England, because I'm more familiar with England. In England, instead of Romans governing all of the different provinces, the land holdings in England, you had Angles, who were a barbarian clan or group. They take over in what would become Northumbria, northern England, directly south of Hadrian's Wall. Saxons, who are another Germanic tribe, they take over southern England, Wessex, as it would become known. And Jutes are the smallest group, but they become the masters of the Isle of Wight and some smaller land holdings, more, again, on the periphery of England. They're doing basically the same things the Romans are doing. They have those people who are obligated to work for their lords. They have the same basic legal structure in place. The only difference is that, obviously, because of cultural reasons, these people will have different priorities than their Roman predecessors did. There's really not a whole lot in terms of operation that's different between what these people are doing and what the Romans are doing. Maybe these people, because they're, quote-unquote barbarians, are a little bit more severe in their punishments. Well, then again, crucifixion's pretty severe, so I don't know. They're just speculation. It doesn't really matter. The point is, these people are pretty much governing land the same way the Romans did. How are they governing it? Well, at this point in time, you could say that feudalism really starts to kick off, and there's one reason for that. That reason is because there's no more Rome to protect all of these land holdings. You can't you can't send a messenger to Rome and say, hey, there's a bunch of barbarians sacking our villages, could you send 20,000 legionnaires up to protect our villages? You can't do that anymore. You have to basically fend for yourself. And what these lords quickly realized was that the most efficient way to protect themselves was to enter into feudal contracts with more powerful and less powerful lords. By entering into these contracts, which is effectively known as vassalage, and I have an example of this coming up. By entering into these contracts with other lords, you're able to optimize your production because you have, you have more, you have fewer worries with regard to protecting your land, and you're able to not only do that, but expand your wealth and your influence within the kingdom that you pledge yourself to. So to kind of put that into a visualization, Here's an example of how vassalage in feudalism works. These are the red lines are all feudal contracts, and you have different classes of people. You could call the sovereign the king. You could call the lord a duke. Lesser lords, counts, and barons, and obviously peasants and serfs are peasants and serfs. So in this example, we have Clovis. Clovis is the king of France, we'll say. Clovis is a nobleman. He has his own land. His land is worked by this peasant Claude, and he's able to produce his own income every year. He has his own soldiers, all of those things. Clovis is the most powerful lord in the land because two dukes, Pierre and Louis, have pledged themselves to Clovis. They've entered into a feudal contract. They are his vassals. And what does one of these contracts look like? They all look different, but basically, in a nutshell, these two are going to agree to give a certain proportion or a certain amount of income to Clovis or product a year. They're going to agree to contribute soldiers if they're called to arms to the army of the sovereign, or they will provide a feudal levy each year. I'll go over what a feudal levy is later when we talk about Manorialism. But basically, they're going to provide resources to the king, or the highest lord, the sovereign, and in exchange, the king, or the sovereign, is going to agree to protect the lands that they all hold and settle disputes between them. So if Pierre and Louis have a conflict, he's going to try to be an independent mediator between the conflict. How well that works in practice, I don't know, but it's nice in theory, at least, is what, they all wanted to have happen. And the same thing is working with regard to Pierre and Louis. Pierre and Louis are powerful dukes. They have their own lands that produce goods, but they're even more powerful because these counts and barons, Henry, Francois, and Guy, have agreed to enter into the same basic feudal contract with these dukes that the dukes have with the king, and so on and so forth. This is how you get a feudal system, in theory at least. So what do these look like in reality? Well, they're found pretty much all over the world, definitely in Europe and Asia. Japan has a really interesting feudal system. I'm not as familiar with the specifics of how it works. I do know that obviously you have the same basic relationship where there's a lord and there are peasants who work on the land. I don't know much else about it, but if you're interested, Japan is a good place to look at with regard to feudalism. The examples I would give you to look up personally, England after the Norman invasion, very good example of feudalism. One of the best, though, the Holy Roman Empire. It's not, what I learned in history, which was correct, is the Holy Roman Empire is not Holy, Roman, or an empire, and all three of those things are true. It's actually a German feudal system that's based on feudalism, not really based on religion. So, how does the Holy Roman Empire work? Well, you have the Holy Roman Emperor. He is the effective sovereign of the Holy Roman Empire. And underneath him, he has a bunch of Germanic kings, or Italian kings, like some of them were Italian. And these kings agree that they will elect the monarch, the emperor. And the mechanism for this is a little bit, it changes over time, and it's not exactly a parallel. But the way it works is that the kings agree that they're going to elect an emperor. The emperor has the right to summon their armies to fight a war if the Holy Roman Empire were to declare war on another state or a rebellious state. And beneath those German kings, you have the same basic relationships going on. You have dukes within the kingdoms, counts within the kingdoms, etc. So the Holy Roman Empire is really nothing more than just a vast feudal system that crosses what would be considered political boundaries between states, like actual kingdoms. They're, the kingdoms of Brandenburg and Pomerania, for example. They're generally recognized as independent nations, but they're all part of the Holy Roman Empire. They're still subject to whatever rules the Holy Roman Emperor is allowed to enact. So that's another interesting example I find to illustrate what feudalism looks like on a more international level. So, with feudalism in place, we can talk about manorialism, which is the economic piece of feudalism, which I find more interesting personally. Um, so, what is manorialism? Well, it is effectively a decentralized economic system that you use to fund and produce things in a feudal system. And it actually dominates Europe, Western Europe, I should say, in particular, um, throughout all of the feudal period, and actually even past that, up until the mercantilist period, and even up until the 19th century, I know of, in some places, possibly even later, depending on where um, you're looking. Um, so, what is the main geography you're looking at in a manor system? Well, it's that feudal estate, the manor, where those counts and those barons, where they live, where they have their fields. That's really where you're looking. It's a very local, very decentralized form of economics. And there are three main classes of people you could talk about with regard to a manor system, at least in a more simplified version. You have the lord, obviously, who owns everything. He has his enforcers. They're really categorized as being part of that. They're part of the lord's entourage, if you will. And then you have the two classes of workers. You have peasants who, they can own land, some of them. They oftentimes would own buildings on the land of a feudal lord. That's actually I couldn't really think of any examples of a peasant owning land. At that point, they're really not a peasant, but they can own structures, I should say, on the lands of a lord, and they had no obligation to work for the lord. So, different from these Roman coloni we talked about, peasants do not have to work a certain amount of time for the lord. They don't have to give a certain proportion of their product to the lord each year. They really just have to pay a tax for where they live, and they can go about their merry way and do whatever they want. With regard, I say that with a big asterisk that they can't do exactly everything they want to do at this point in history, but that's just kind of given. A serf is the other type of worker. Serfs are the inheritors of that Roman colony group. They are tied to the land and have a feudal obligation to work for the lord a certain number of days a year, or sometimes they could pay the lord for their service instead. So if they happen to acquire a lot of money from selling outputs that they did produce from the prior year, occasionally they could pay off their obligation and not have to work for the lord, but that was very rare. Sometimes they could pay off their obligation through output instead of time. It really just depended. There's no standard feudal contract. There's just basic tenants associated with each one. But serfs are effectively the lowest class of people if you're talking at this time. Now, it's important to note serfs are very different than slaves, and I wanted to put that in there because serfs are not viewed as property at this point in time. They're considered people, they're considered citizens, but they don't have full rights as citizens. They can, if somebody harms them, they can go to the lord and ask for restitution or ask for punishment. They're allowed to do all of those things, which slaves, in most places, couldn't do because they were property. The owner would actually have to advocate for the slave, and it would be treated almost as like property damage, which is a kind of sick way to do things, in my opinion. It's a different time period, so it's all relative. But serfs are very different than slaves. They are not the same in any sense as slaves. Moving on, what are the components of a typical manor home? Well, you have the actual castle or the lord's estate and his personal fields that are worked by his peasants and serfs. But obviously, the castle itself, that's the main component people usually think of when they think of manor home. That nice medieval castle or medieval manor home if you're in England. There's a lot of them left. And then there are two main types of land. Well, You have one, land worked by your serfs who are under obligation to work for you. Um, Occasionally, as I said, this land would not be worked by serfs for the Lord. The serfs would actually work the land themselves and sell the output, but that's only if they were able to fulfill their obligation through labor, money, or some other type of payment, which was also possible. And then the other type of land was land owned by free peasants. And again, these holdings, they're really holdings. They're not. It's not like the peasant owned the land independent of the lord. It's still on the lord's land. It's just that the peasant had right to the land. Um, the peasant, this land was not obligated to produce output for the lord. Rather, the lord would simply tax the land, and the peasant would have to pay that. But the peasants really were, in this sense, relative to the serfs, autonomous. They could sell their output. They weren't tied to the land the same way that serfs were. They had much more mobility. So what does a manor economy look like in theory? This is just kind of a very generic model I built. It's not country specific or anything. This is just a very basic manor economy. So you have some king, King Alpha. He has his own fields, as I said, because the king is still a lord, just like all the other ones. And he's able to produce 100 units of output, say potatoes, whatever product you want. And he's got two vassal lords, Lord Beta and Lord Delta. And they both are providing different services for the king. They both have different types of contracts that they're following. Beta, he produces 75 units of output on his land. Every year he has to give 20 units of output as tribute to Alpha. So 20 of those potatoes are going to King Alpha. And he also has to contribute soldiers to a feudal levy. I didn't talk about this before. Feudal levies were a part of that obligation in many cases. And the way a levy works is that the king talks to the vassal, Beta, and he tells Beta, okay, for every family in your lands, I expect you to contribute one fighting age individual to my armed forces. And in this period in time, it's a male. So I expect, as the king, you, Beta, to give me 50 fighting age males because you have 50 families living on your land. And the way it should work, if you're being equitable about it, is that Beta goes to each of the 50 families. He asks them to give up one of their children, or one of the males of the household, to males of the family, to fight for the king. Now, the way it could work in practice is, though, Beta could go to one family who has 10 fighting age males and say, okay, all 10 of you are going to go fight for the king, and this I command. You really can't do anything about it. At this point in time, you really couldn't say no to a feudal levy. You could be, you'd be tortured or put to death if you said no. So that's in a nutshell what a feudal levy is. It's basically just a military contribution of a certain number of people each year. And again, what it depends on varies. It could be one fighting age male for every 3 fighting age males. I expect 1/3 of the population, one per each family. That one per each family is the one I've seen the most. Back to the example. Beta, 75% of his lands are worked by serfs, so he's living the good life. He's got 75% of his workers who are obligated to work for him each year. Just 25% are peasants who pay tax to him. Delta, on the other hand, is he's not necessarily a weaker lord. He just has a different setup, a different demographic he's working with. He produces 50 units of output potatoes each year. He has to give 25 of them to King Alpha, but he doesn't have to contribute soldiers in the form of a levy. Again, different feudal contracts. It's very possible you have different contracts for different lords. It's not uncommon. 1/3 of his land is worked by serfs. 2/3 are worked by peasants. So, the reason why I did that is to kind of illustrate, like, okay, well, one would suspect that from the perspective of the lord, you're going to have more output if more of your people are required to work for you. than if fewer people are required to work for you. That's just kind of intuitive. Um, so under this regime, Alpha would collect 45 units of output from each of these lords as tribute, or you could think of it almost as his own tax on the lords. And in addition to that 45 units, he's going to gain conscripts, soldiers, from Beta each year in the form of the levy, and he's going to obviously keep that 100 units of output from his own lands. So you could say at this point in time that the kingdom Alpha owns, or the kingdom Alpha rules, if it were during this time period, he owns the kingdom, obviously, because this is a feudal time period. But the kingdom that Alpha governs effectively produces 145 units of output. And the remainder of this output is kept by the lord. And then the serfs are obviously allowed to keep some of their output from whatever time they're allowed to work. The peasants keep their own output. And any lords who are vassals of Beta and Delta, they're going to basically have this same relationship that Beta and Delta have. They're going to have maybe tribute in the form of output or money. They're going to have possibly a levy, and the levy of their vassals can contribute to the levy imposed by the king. So this is how a manor economy works in theory. It's very decentralized. It's very local. Agriculture is obviously the most prominent form of economic activity at this point in time. It's a very self-sufficiency is very important to a manor economy. You want to be able to take care of the manor independently in terms of your sustenance. Obviously, for protection reasons, you being part of a greater kingdom is usually beneficial. But from the standpoint of Beta, he wants to be able to be self-sufficient in terms of output and sustenance for his people. So, I hope you found this video to be somewhat helpful in understanding feudalism and manorialism. I assume a lot of people probably have some knowledge of the concepts, but hopefully this video maybe taught you something interesting about it or helped to clarify something. So thank you, and good luck with whatever you're learning this for, school or personal interest, whatever you want. Thank you.